It was a cold and rainy evening, the kind of evening where the streets glistened under the streetlights and the air carried a quiet, almost lonely feeling. Inside a small diner at the corner of the town, the lights were warm and the aroma of fresh coffee and grilled sandwiches made it feel like a little safe haven. The diner wasn't big and it wasn't fancy, but it had a charm that made people feel comfortable. The owner, a woman who had run it for years, was busy behind the counter, wiping tables, refilling coffee cups, and greeting the few regular customers who had come in to escape the rain. She had a smile for everyone. Even when the day had been long and tiring, the rain had started in the late afternoon, and by the time the evening came, it was pouring heavily. Most of the usual customers were staying home, and the diner was quiet. She enjoyed these quieter moments, sometimes just standing by the counter, looking out at the wet streets, listening to the steady drumming of raindrops on the roof. It made her think about life, about small joys, and about the little choices that could change a day, or even a life. As she was pouring a cup of coffee, she noticed someone outside through the fogged-up windows. A man was standing under the weak light of the street lamp, soaked almost completely, his clothes clinging to him as he shivered in the cold. There was something about him that made her pause. He didn't look threatening. He didn't look angry. He looked tired. He looked hungry. She couldn't tell exactly why, but something in the way he leaned against the lamppost, with his head slightly down and his hands stuffed in his wet pockets, made her heart pull in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. She wiped her hands and walked over to the door. The bell rang softly as she opened it, letting in a little gust of cold wind that mixed with the warm air of the diner. The man stepped inside, hesitating for a moment as he shook off the rain. His hair was wet, his face looked worn, and his eyes held a kind of quiet shame that made her feel even more certain that he needed help. "Evening," she said softly, giving him a small smile. He nodded, barely lifting his head. "Evening," he replied, his voice low and rough from cold and fatigue. She could see that he was hungry. His hands, when he took them out of his pockets, were slightly shaking. She quickly moved behind the counter and started preparing a hot meal. She didn't ask questions. Sometimes it was better to just act, to offer help without judging or wondering why someone needed it. She put together a plate with a generous sandwich, a bowl of soup, and a cup of coffee. She brought it over to him, placing it on a small table near the window. "You can sit here," she said gently. "It's on the house." He looked up at her, surprise flickering in his eyes. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came out at first. He just nodded, a little hesitantly, and then carefully sat down, his hands resting on his knees. She watched him for a moment. He looked like someone who hadn't been treated kindly in a long time, someone who was used to being ignored or turned away. As he picked up the sandwich, he seemed unsure of how to start. He took a small bite, then another, slowly, almost as if he was afraid it might disappear if he ate too quickly. The way he ate made her heart ache, but it also made her smile. Sometimes the simplest act of giving could make a difference, even if it was just letting someone eat a warm meal when they had nothing else. She went back to the counter, pretending to be busy, but she kept sneaking glances at him. He was quiet, polite, and careful not to make a mess. When he finally looked up at her and gave a small, almost shy smile, she felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee or the soup. It was the warmth of knowing that a small choice, a small act of kindness, could mean the world to someone. The diner was still quiet, just the sound of the rain outside and the faint hum of the refrigerator. Occasionally, a car would drive past, splashing water on the streets, but otherwise it felt like they were in their own little bubble, separated from the rest of the world. She wondered briefly about him. Where had he come from? Why was he out in the rain? But then she shook her head. It didn't matter. Right now he needed a meal and she could give it to him. He finished the sandwich and sipped the coffee. He looked at the soup, hesitated for a moment, then picked up the spoon. Every movement he made was careful and thoughtful, as if he was savoring not just the food but the fact that someone had cared enough to give it to him. She felt a tear threaten to fall, but she quickly blinked it away. She didn't need tears. She just needed to be there to let him feel welcome. After a while, he set the spoon down and looked around the diner. "Thank you," he said quietly, finally finding his voice. I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," she replied with a small smile. "Just eat and stay warm." He nodded, but she could see the gratitude in his eyes. It wasn't just a polite gesture. It was deep, sincere, and it touched her in a way she hadn't expected. For a moment, the rain, the cold, the long hours of work, they all faded. There was just this human connection, simple and pure, formed over a warm meal and a kind gesture. He finished the last bite and looked down at the table. She noticed that his hands were still shaking slightly, and she brought him another cup of coffee without a word. He took it and smiled faintly, and for the first time that evening, he seemed a little lighter, as if a small weight had been lifted from his shoulders. When he finally stood to leave, he paused near the door. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the streets outside glimmered under the faint streetlights. He looked at her, this stranger who had given him a meal when he had nothing, and he said, "You didn't have to do that. But I won't forget it." She smiled, a little unsure of what to say. "Just take care of yourself," she said softly. He nodded, then stepped out into the night. She watched him walk away, disappearing into the misty streets. The bell on the door jingled softly as it closed behind him, and she felt an odd emptiness but also a strange warmth. Sometimes helping someone felt like giving away a piece of your heart, and she realized in that quiet moment that she wouldn't hesitate to do it again. She went back to her counter, cleaned up the table, and poured herself a cup of coffee. She looked out the window at the wet streets, thinking about the man and the way he had eaten that meal. So carefully, so gratefully. She didn't know his story, and she didn't know what had brought him to her diner that night, but she knew one thing. She had made a difference, however small. The rest of the evening passed quietly. She served a few more customers, all regulars who chatted about their day and the weather, but her mind kept returning to the man. She wondered where he would go, what he would do, and if life would treat him kindly after this small gesture of hers. There was something comforting in the thought that, for one evening, she had made the world a little warmer for someone. By the time she finally closed the diner, the rain had stopped completely. The streets were empty, and the town was silent save for the occasional drip of water from the rooftops. She stepped outside for a moment, letting the cool air wash over her. The world felt peaceful, and in that peace she felt a quiet hope. Maybe, just maybe, her small act of kindness would ripple further than she could ever imagine. She locked the door and walked back inside, tired but content. She poured another cup of coffee, sat down, and thought about the man. She didn't know his name, and she might never see him again, but she knew that one meal, one moment of understanding and generosity, could change the course of a life. And in that thought she found a deep, gentle joy that stayed with her long after the diner was quiet, long after the lights were turned off, and long after the rain had washed the streets clean. For the first time that evening, she truly felt the quiet magic of human kindness, and she knew that her little diner had been more than a place to eat. That night it had been a place where compassion lived, even if only for a moment, and she promised herself she would always make room for it, no matter how small the gesture, no matter how little she had to give. The next morning, the diner felt different, though she couldn't say exactly why. She opened the doors as usual, the smell of fresh bread and brewing coffee filling the small space. The usual morning crowd trickled in, chatting quietly about the weather, work, and small-town life. Everything seemed ordinary, but her mind kept drifting back to the man who had come in the night before. She remembered the way he had eaten, so carefully, so gratefully. Something about him stayed in her thoughts, a gentle presence she couldn't shake. As she was wiping down the counter, she noticed a small package sitting on one of the tables near the window. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew she hadn't left it there, and the man from last night hadn't returned. It was a simple brown envelope tied with a thin string, and it seemed almost too ordinary to carry any importance. Yet somehow she felt it was meant for her. She picked it up carefully and untied the string. Inside was a small handwritten note and a tiny, delicate object wrapped in soft cloth. The note was simple but heartfelt. It said something along the lines of, "Thank you for your kindness. It may mean more than you realize." There was no signature, no explanation, just these few words written in neat, careful handwriting. She unfolded the cloth around the object. At first, it looked like a small, ordinary keepsake, a coin or a carved piece of wood. Something simple enough that anyone might overlook it. But there was a weight to it, a presence that felt important. She turned it over in her hand, examining the details, and felt a strange mix of curiosity and wonder. Why had he left this? Was it just a gift, a token of gratitude, or was there something more to it? Her curiosity wouldn't let her focus on work that morning. Every time she tried to pour coffee or refill a plate, her eyes kept drifting back to the package. She wondered about the man's story. Where had he come from? Why had he been out in the rain starving and yet so careful, so polite? And why leave her this small, mysterious object? There were so many questions and no answers. She decided to set the object aside on a shelf behind the counter and try to go about her day. She greeted the customers, took orders, and served breakfast as usual. A few regulars noticed her distracted mood and asked what was wrong, but she simply smiled and waved them off, not ready to share what had happened. She wanted to keep this moment private, something between her and the memory of the man. By mid-morning, the diner began to fill a little more. People were coming in to escape the chilly drizzle that had returned, and the smell of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee made the space feel warm and inviting. Yet, even with the noise and movement, her mind kept returning to the package. She wondered if she should try to find out more about the object, perhaps take it to an expert, but she hesitated. There was something delicate about it, something that demanded careful handling and patience. A few hours later, as she was washing dishes, a young woman came in, carrying a notebook and a camera. She introduced herself as a journalist for the local paper, curious about small stories of kindness in the town. The woman had heard about the diner and wanted to write a piece on places that made a difference in people's lives. She asked if she could sit down and ask a few questions. The diner owner agreed, and as they talked, she found herself sharing the story of the man from the previous night. She described how he had appeared out of the rain, hungry and tired, and how she had offered him a meal without hesitation. She didn't mention the package yet, not knowing if it was part of the story she wanted to tell. The journalist listened intently, nodding and occasionally jotting down notes. When she finished, the journalist asked, "Do you think small acts like this really make a difference?" The diner owner smiled softly. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I do know that it made a difference to me. Even a simple meal, given without thinking, can change someone's day. And sometimes you don't even know how far that change can go." After the journalist left, she returned to the counter and picked up the package again. She felt a sudden courage to examine it more closely. Carefully, she unwrapped it, noticing the craftsmanship of the object. It wasn't just a keepsake. It was something rare, something that clearly had value, though she couldn't place it immediately. The edges were worn, but it had intricate details, and she could tell it had been made with care. She decided to take a photograph of it with her phone, planning to show it to a friend who knew a little about antiques and collectibles. As she did, a thought struck her. Perhaps the man had been more than just a stranger in need. Perhaps he had a story, a history, a reason for leaving this object with her. The idea made her both nervous and excited. She had never been involved in anything like this before, and the uncertainty made her pulse quicken. That evening, after the diner closed and the last customers had left, she finally allowed herself to sit down and examine the object more carefully. She noticed small markings that seemed like symbols, tiny letters etched into the surface, almost like a code. Her curiosity grew stronger. She realized that this small token could be more important than she had first thought. It wasn't just a gift, it was a message, a connection, and perhaps even an opportunity. Over the next few days, the diner felt a subtle shift. People who had never visited before started coming in. Some were regulars' friends, curious about the place they had heard so much about. Others were simply passing through town, drawn in by the warmth of the diner on rainy days. She noticed something she hadn't before. These new customers were kind, respectful, and often left generous tips. It was as if the diner itself had become a place of quiet magic, a center of goodwill, though she didn't understand why. Each day, she would take a few moments to sit by the counter, holding the object, turning it over in her hands, and thinking about the man who had left it. She imagined him walking through streets far away, thinking about her kindness, and felt a deep connection to someone she might never see again. The thought made her heart swell, and she found herself smiling more often, greeting customers with extra warmth, and taking a little more joy in the small details of life. One afternoon, a friend stopped by the diner. They were curious about her distracted mood and asked if everything was okay. She hesitated, but then decided to share a little. She told them about the mysterious man, the meal she had given, and the package he had left behind. Her friend listened, eyes widening as she described the object. "You should show this to someone who really knows about antiques," her friend suggested. It could be valuable, and even if it's not, it's clearly something special. She nodded, considering the idea. She had been hesitant to involve anyone else, worried that the magic of the moment might be lost. But now she realized that sharing it could help her understand it better, and perhaps even reveal the man's story. She decided she would take the object to someone knowledgeable, someone who could tell her if it had historical or monetary value. That evening, she carefully wrapped the object again and placed it in a small box. She felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. What if it was worthless? What if it was something ordinary after all the wonder she had imagined? And yet part of her hoped that it was extraordinary, something that could change her life in ways she hadn't yet imagined. As she closed the diner for the night, she looked out at the empty, rain-slicked streets and thought about the man. She didn't know his name, didn't know where he had come from, and didn't know if she would ever see him again, but she knew one thing. He had left something behind that mattered, something that connected their lives in a way neither of them could have predicted. She felt a quiet excitement, a sense of waiting for something important to happen. The diner had always been her safe place, her small world, but now it felt like a doorway to something bigger, something unexpected. The thought was thrilling and a little frightening, but she welcomed it. Sometimes life had a way of rewarding simple acts of kindness in the most surprising ways, and she felt that this was one of those moments. As she turned off the lights and stepped outside, the streets glimmered under the moonlight, wet and shining like silver. The air was cool and crisp, and for a moment she felt as if anything was possible. The package, the mysterious object, the man who had entered her life for just one night. It all felt like the beginning of a story she hadn't yet written. A story full of surprises, lessons, and perhaps even miracles. She went home that night with a lightness in her heart, carrying the box carefully, knowing that what had started as a simple act of kindness had already begun to change her life. She didn't know how or when, but she felt certain that the world had responded in its own quiet, mysterious way, and she realized that sometimes the smallest gestures, sharing a meal, showing compassion, offering a little warmth in a cold world, could create ripples far bigger than anyone could imagine. The next few days passed with a strange mixture of ordinary routine and quiet excitement. The diner was back to its usual rhythm, the smell of coffee, the sizzle of eggs on the griddle, the chatter of morning customers. But something about the air felt different. She noticed small changes that seemed almost magical. Regulars who came in daily smiled a little brighter, spoke a little softer, and sometimes lingered longer than usual. New visitors appeared at the diner, as if drawn by an invisible thread. Strangers who spoke politely, left generous tips, or shared kind words before leaving. She couldn't help but wonder if it had anything to do with the small object left by the man. She would take it out occasionally, turning it over in her hands, studying the tiny engravings and symbols that seemed to hide a story she didn't yet understand. It was more than just a gift. It felt like a key, something that could unlock possibilities she hadn't imagined. She kept it on the counter when the diner was open, hoping in some quiet, hopeful way that someone might notice it and perhaps recognize it. One afternoon, as she was wiping down the tables, a man walked in, neatly dressed but carrying an air of quiet purpose. He approached the counter and greeted her politely. "Excuse me," he said. "I heard about a small item that was recently found. It's quite rare, and I was wondering if you could show it to me." Her heart skipped a beat. Could it be? She carefully retrieved the wrapped object from the shelf and handed it to him. The man's eyes widened as he examined it, a mixture of surprise and recognition in his expression. This is extraordinary," he said softly. "Where did you get it?" She explained, recounting the story of the man who had come in during the rain, the meal she had offered, and the small package he had left behind. The man listened intently, nodding occasionally, and then shook his head slightly in disbelief. "You don't realize how lucky you are," he said. "This object is very rare, something collectors or historians would travel far and wide to see. But more importantly, it's connected to a larger story, a history that's remarkable." She felt a mix of astonishment and confusion. She had never expected this. What had seemed like a small token of gratitude was actually something valuable, something with a story that stretched far beyond her little diner. She realized, for the first time, that the man who had left it behind must have known its significance. It wasn't just a gift. It was a message, a recognition of her kindness, and perhaps even a reward for her generosity. The man offered to help her understand it better. Over the next few hours, he examined the object carefully, explaining its details, its origin, and the rare qualities that made it unique. She listened, amazed, feeling as though she had stumbled into a story that was larger than life. Each detail he shared made her heart beat faster. The object had been in the hands of someone important long ago, a person whose life had touched many others. Now, it had found its way to her, because of a simple act of kindness. As he spoke, she noticed a subtle change in the diner. The few customers who were still there seemed more attentive, more engaged. A sense of warmth and curiosity filled the room, as if the diner itself was responding to the presence of this rare object. She realized that the story wasn't just about the man who had left the package or the object itself. It was about the ripple effect of small, compassionate actions. A simple act of generosity had created a chain of events that extended far beyond her imagination. The man eventually left, leaving her with a sense of awe and a promise that she could reach out to him if she wanted to learn more. She placed the object carefully back on the counter, turning it over in her hands one last time that evening. It felt different now. It felt alive, like it carried a message not just from the past but from the universe itself. A message about the power of kindness and how even the smallest gestures could have extraordinary consequences. The days that followed were filled with unexpected surprises. More visitors came to the diner, some curious about the unusual item, others simply drawn by the word-of-mouth stories of a place where kindness was celebrated. Local media even caught wind of the story. A small article appeared in the town's newspaper about the diner and the mysterious object, highlighting the act of generosity that had sparked such attention. The woman found herself both nervous and thrilled, unsure how to handle the growing interest, but grateful that her small gesture had been recognized in a positive way. Her friends and family were equally amazed. They came to the diner, curious to see the object and hear the story firsthand. Each person who walked in seemed to carry a sense of wonder, as if witnessing the magic of the ordinary turning into the extraordinary. She realized that she was no longer just a diner owner. She had become part of a story that transcended her own small world. Her simple choice to feed a starving man had set off a chain reaction that touched many lives, and she was beginning to see that her actions mattered more than she had ever known. One evening, as she was closing the diner, she thought about the man again. She wondered where he had gone, what his life was like, and whether he knew the full impact of what he had started. Had he left the object simply as a token of gratitude, or had he known it would eventually change her life? The questions swirled in her mind, but she felt a deep sense of peace. Whatever his intentions, she knew that this encounter had been meaningful, and she cherished it deeply. She spent the next few weeks learning more about the object, reaching out to experts, reading about its history, and understanding its significance. Each discovery was like a new chapter unfolding, revealing layers she had never imagined. The more she learned, the more she appreciated the connection between her act of kindness and the remarkable journey of the object. It was a lesson in patience, curiosity, and trust. Trust that the universe sometimes rewards generosity in ways that are beyond human understanding. During this time, she also noticed subtle changes in herself. She felt more confident, more open to new experiences, and more willing to trust in the goodness of others. Her interactions with customers became warmer, more genuine. She started small initiatives to help those in need, inspired by the stranger who had come into her diner during the rain. Each act of kindness, no matter how small, seemed to carry a ripple effect, touching lives in ways she hadn't anticipated. The diner itself seemed to thrive in response. More people came not just for the food, but for the warmth, the story, and the sense of connection they felt there. The atmosphere became a reflection of her own growth, welcoming, kind, and full of quiet magic. She realized that while the object was extraordinary, the true value lay in the way it had transformed her perspective, her life, and the lives of those around her. One day a letter arrived for her at the diner. It was handwritten, simple and elegant. Inside, It thanked her again for her kindness and hinted at the deeper significance of the object she now possessed. It spoke of trust, compassion, and the quiet power of generosity. She felt a lump in her throat, realizing that the man who had left the object had created something far bigger than she had imagined. She was part of a story that celebrated human goodness, a reminder that even small gestures could echo across time and space. As she placed the letter next to the object, she reflected on everything that had happened. What had started as a single act of generosity had grown into a journey of discovery, connection, and transformation. The man who had come into her diner had left more than a meal could ever convey. He had left a message, a challenge, and a gift, a reminder that life's small choices could lead to unexpected miracles. She looked around her diner, noticing the way the light fell softly on the tables, the way the air carried the scent of coffee and bread, and the quiet hum of life moving steadily forward. Everything felt connected. The diner, the object, the visitors, the letters, and the ripple effect of kindness that had begun with one simple choice. She understood now that life had a way of rewarding those who acted with compassion, even in ways that were not immediately visible. That night, as she closed the doors and walked home, she carried the object carefully along with the letter. She felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the tangible discoveries, but for the lessons she had learned about generosity, trust, and the hidden ways the world can respond to human goodness. She knew that the journey was far from over. There would be more surprises, more discoveries, and more connections waiting for her. But she also knew that she had grown, changed, and been awakened to a deeper understanding of life's quiet magic. She went to bed that night with a sense of wonder, thinking about the man who had appeared out of the rain, the small object that had started this journey, and the countless possibilities that lay ahead. She realized that sometimes the simplest acts, feeding someone, showing kindness, trusting in others, could create ripples far larger than one could ever imagine. And she felt ready more than ever to see where this remarkable story would take her next. The following week brought a feeling of anticipation that she couldn't explain. Each day at the diner seemed brighter, warmer, and more alive than before. It wasn't just the sunlight filtering through the windows or the smell of fresh coffee and bread. It was the energy, the sense that something significant was unfolding, something that was bigger than her daily routine. She found herself thinking constantly about the man, the mysterious object, and the message of gratitude he had left behind. One afternoon, as she was wiping down the counter, a letter arrived in the mail. The envelope was thick and heavy, unlike any letter she had received before. There was no return address, just her name written neatly on the front. She felt a flutter in her chest as she opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten note, and as she read it, her eyes widened in disbelief. The note explained that the man who had visited her diner was not just a traveler or a stranger in need. He had a remarkable story, a life of unexpected challenges and extraordinary accomplishments. The note revealed that the object he had left behind was not only rare but deeply significant. It had belonged to someone whose life had influenced countless others, someone whose actions had shaped history in small but important ways. The man had wanted to reward her kindness, to honor the fact that she had offered help without judgment, without hesitation, without asking for anything in return. It was a recognition of her humanity, a way to show that her compassion had meaning far beyond what she could see. She sat down at the counter, holding the letter in her hands, her mind racing. She felt a mixture of astonishment, gratitude, and a strange sense of humility. A simple act, feeding a hungry man on a rainy night, had created a connection to someone remarkable and had opened a door to something she could never have imagined. She realized that life sometimes responded to kindness in ways that were subtle, mysterious, and powerful, rewarding those who acted with genuine care. Later that afternoon, the door to the diner opened and a man stepped inside. He was well-dressed but had a quiet, unassuming presence. When he spoke, his voice was calm but filled with warmth. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said, "but I believe you have something that belongs to me, or at least something that was meant for you to discover." She recognized him immediately. The man from the rainy night, the one who had eaten so carefully, so humbly. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected to see him again, and yet here he was, standing in the doorway of her diner as if nothing in the world could be more ordinary. He walked slowly toward the counter, his eyes scanning the diner with a quiet interest. She handed him the object, wrapped carefully, and he took it in his hands. There was a moment of silence, a pause so profound it felt as if time itself had stopped. Then he looked at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You could have ignored me," he said softly. "You didn't. You chose kindness. That simple choice matters more than most people realize." She felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had never thought of herself as remarkable, only as someone doing what felt right in the moment. But his words, the weight behind them, made her see that sometimes the quiet choices, the unnoticed acts of compassion, were the ones that truly shaped the world. He explained more about the object and its history. It had been passed down through generations, each person recognizing its value not just in material terms but as a symbol of trust, integrity, and generosity. Now, by leaving it with her, he had created a connection, a story that intertwined their lives in a way neither of them could have predicted. As he spoke, she realized that this encounter was about more than an object or a gift. It was about the choices people make, the moments when kindness outweighs convenience, the times when empathy guides action. The man had seen her heart, recognized her willingness to care, and had chosen to honor it in the most extraordinary way. He stayed in the diner for a while, sharing stories of his life, not as a boast but as a reflection on the paths he had walked, the lessons he had learned, and the people who had helped him along the way. She listened, fascinated, feeling a connection that went beyond words. She realized that life was full of unexpected encounters, and sometimes the smallest gestures could lead to profound experiences that shaped both her world and the world of others. When he finally stood to leave, he paused at the door. "Remember," he said, "kindness is never wasted. Every small act has the power to change a life, sometimes in ways you will never know." She watched him walk away, feeling a sense of awe and gratitude. The diner felt different now, almost as if it had been touched by something larger than life. She realized that the object, the man, and the experience had changed her perspective. She no longer saw her days as ordinary. Each customer, each interaction, each moment held the potential for connection, for compassion, and for small miracles. Over the next few days, the diner became a place of quiet reverence. People who came in sensed something special, even if they couldn't put it into words. Regulars spoke more kindly to each other. Strangers smiled at one another. The atmosphere was lighter, warmer, filled with an invisible sense of hope. She understood that this was the ripple effect of her actions. The simple act of feeding someone in need had created waves of goodness that extended far beyond what she could see. She began to reflect more deeply on her own life, considering how she could continue to make a difference. The man's visit had reminded her that small gestures were powerful and that every choice mattered. She started small initiatives to help those in need, quietly offering meals to those who couldn't afford them, donating to local causes, and offering support to people struggling in ways she had never considered before. Each act was guided by the lesson she had learned, that kindness given freely had a power that went beyond expectation. One evening, as she closed the diner and stepped outside, she looked up at the sky. The rain had returned, but it didn't feel cold or harsh. Instead, it felt cleansing, refreshing, like a reminder that life's challenges were often temporary, and that acts of compassion could bring light even in the darkest times. She thought about the man, about the object, and about the journey she had been on. She realized that she had been given more than a gift. She had been given a lesson in humanity, in trust, and in the quiet ways the world responds to goodness. She placed the object in a special box she had prepared, setting it carefully on a shelf in the diner. It was no longer just a curiosity or a mysterious token. It was a symbol, a reminder of what had happened, of the choices she had made, and of the possibilities that awaited when people acted with heart. She knew that she would treasure it not just for its material value, but for what it represented, the connection between two lives, the proof that generosity could be recognized and celebrated, and the reminder that every act of kindness mattered. From that day forward, the diner felt like more than a place to eat. It was a sanctuary, a space where human goodness was visible in small ways, in a smile, a kind word, a shared meal. She welcomed everyone who came through the door, always remembering the night when a starving man had walked in and changed her life forever. The experience had opened her eyes to the beauty of human connection, the impact of generosity, and the hidden ways the world could reward compassion. As the weeks turned into months, she continued to operate the diner with renewed energy and purpose. People noticed the difference, the warmth, the kindness, the sense of community, and it drew even more visitors. The diner became known not just for its food, but for the spirit that filled it, the unspoken understanding that this was a place where every action mattered, and every person could make a difference. She often thought about the man and wondered if he ever reflected on that night. Had he realized how far-reaching his gift would be? Did he know that his small act of leaving the object would transform her life and the lives of so many others? She didn't know, and maybe she never would, but she felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense of gratitude that went beyond words. Life, she realized, was full of unexpected connections, quiet miracles, and opportunities to act with heart. The diner had become a symbol of all that was possible when kindness was chosen over indifference, when generosity was given freely, and when people believed in the goodness of others. And she knew deep in her heart that this was only the beginning, that her journey of compassion, inspired by a stranger and a small mysterious object, would continue to unfold in ways she could never fully imagine. The weeks following the man's visit brought a quiet but profound change in her life. The diner, once a small corner of the town where she worked tirelessly day after day, had begun to feel like something bigger than herself. People came not only for the food, but for the warmth and the kindness that seemed to fill the room. Strangers smiled at each other. Regulars shared stories more openly. Even the simplest interactions carried a sense of connection, as if the diner had become a small sanctuary where the ordinary met the extraordinary. She often found herself thinking back to that rainy night, the night when the man had walked in, tired, hungry, and cautious. She remembered the way he had eaten his meal, carefully, quietly, and with gratitude. She remembered the small package he had left behind and how that single act had sparked a series of events she could never have imagined. Every time she reflected on it, she felt a mixture of humility, awe, and a deep understanding of the power of human kindness. One afternoon, a young couple walked into the diner. They had heard the story from friends and were curious to see the place where kindness had made such a difference. She greeted them warmly, offering them a table near the window. As they sat and ordered, they shared their own story of hardship, struggling to make ends meet, worrying about bills, and feeling unseen in the busy world. She listened carefully, pouring coffee and offering small gestures of comfort, just as she had done for the man on that rainy night. By the time the couple left, they were smiling, their burden feeling lighter, even if just for a moment. Watching them go, she realized that her role in the world had changed. It wasn't just about running a diner. It was about offering a space where people could feel safe, understood, and cared for. Every small act of kindness, each meal, each smile, each listening ear, was creating ripples she could never fully measure. The mysterious object still sat on the counter, carefully wrapped and displayed with subtle reverence. People often noticed it and asked about it, sensing its significance even without knowing the full story. She shared a little, enough to convey that it was a symbol of gratitude and kindness, without giving away every detail. There was magic in the mystery, she realized, a way for people to feel inspired by the story without needing to fully understand it. One morning, as she was arranging the tables and wiping down the counters, a letter arrived addressed to her. It was elegant, handwritten, and bore no return address. Inside was a note from the man himself, expressing thanks once again. He spoke of how her choice to help him had reminded him of the goodness that still existed in the world, and how her actions had inspired him to